The humid Caribbean air, thick with salt and the promise of another piña colada, was a universe away from the crisp, manicured conformity of Oakhaven Estates. My wife, Sarah, and our 2 kids, Emily and Ben, were finally unwinding. 2 weeks. 14 days of disconnecting from the relentless grind, the endless briefs, the courtroom battles that defined my existence as a federal prosecutor. I'd earned this. We'd earned this. The postcard-perfect sunsets were a balm, the laughter of my children a symphony. I'd even managed to forget, for a blissful while, the petty tyrannies of our homeowners association, personified by its president, one Carol Rumsfeld, a woman whose lust for control was matched only by her spectacularly awful taste in lawn ornamentation. The little fiefdom she ruled with an iron fist and a dog-eared copy of the CCRs was a distant, almost comical memory. Or so I thought. The return flight was smooth. The kids miraculously behaved, buoyed by sugar and the lingering thrill of adventure. We pulled onto our street, Elm Drive, just as dusk was painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. My street. My house. Except it wasn't. Not entirely. There was a new garish "sold" sign hammered crookedly into our pristine lawn, its red letters screaming a betrayal I couldn't yet comprehend. A strange, sensible sedan I'd never seen before was parked in my driveway. My driveway? Sarah gasped beside me. What? What is that? Is this a joke? Her voice was thin, a thread of disbelief. Ben, ever the literalist, piped up from the back. Daddy, someone put a sign on our grass. And that's not Mommy's car. Emily, older, wiser in her 10 years, was silent, her eyes wide, mirroring the cold dread that was beginning to snake its way up my spine. I killed the engine. The silence in the car was heavy, suffocating. My mind, trained to process facts, to assemble narratives from disparate pieces of evidence, was struggling to catch up with the visceral reality. This wasn't a prank. This was something else, something monstrous. I got out, my movements stiff, automated. Each step towards the front door felt like wading through cement. The locks were different. Our old, familiar brass knob and deadbolt were gone, replaced by a shiny, anonymous silver set. My key, the one that had granted me sanctuary for a decade, was now just a useless piece of metal. A light flicked on in the living room. Figures moved behind our curtains. Our curtains. The injustice of it was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. This was more than an error, more than a misunderstanding. This was a violation, profound and absolute. My carefully constructed world, the haven I'd built for my family, had been breached, defiled. The initial shock was giving way to a cold, crystalline rage, the kind I usually reserved for unrepentant criminals staring me down from the witness stand. Someone, somehow, had sold my house from under me while I was sipping cocktails thousands of miles away, and I had a sickeningly accurate premonition of who was behind it. Carol Rumsfeld. The name tasted like ash in my mouth. Her endless stream of violation notices, the grass a quarter-inch too long, the unapproved shade of our mailbox, the aesthetic disturbance of Ben's brightly colored bicycle left momentarily on the porch, had always been a source of irritation, a low-grade hum of suburban absurdity. But this transcended petty. This was grand larceny. This was a declaration of war. I could feel the shift inside me, the click of a switch. The vacationing father, the relaxed husband, was receding, replaced by the federal lawyer, the one who dismantled organized crime rings for a living. The one who understood, with surgical precision, the power of the law when wielded correctly. They hadn't just sold my house. They had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had poked the wrong bear. No, they had attempted to steal the bear's entire cave, with the bear's family still metaphorically inside. The porch light of my stolen home cast a sickly yellow glow on the sold sign. It was an epitaph for their ignorance. The absurdity was a bitter pill. I, who navigated the labyrinthine corridors of federal justice, was locked out of my own home by a suburban despot. The legal mind began to whir, cataloging, assessing, forgery, illegal eviction, conspiracy, fraud, the charges unspooled like an indictment. This wasn't just about getting my house back. This was about ensuring that the entity, the very structure that allowed this to happen, would cease to exist. My phone felt heavy in my hand. First call. Local police to report a break-in. An illegal occupation. Second call. My associate, a sharp young lawyer named Jess, who owed me a few favors and possessed a near-supernatural ability to unearth digital skeletons. The fight hadn't even begun, but a grim certainty settled over me. They had crossed a line etched not in HOA bylaws, but in fundamental justice. And they were about to learn in excruciating detail what happens when you try to strip a man of his home, his sanctuary, his peace. They didn't know who I was. They were about to find out. The air was still, the neighborhood quiet, deceptively peaceful. But for me, Oak Haven Estates had just become a battlefield, and I was armed for total war. The new owners, a bewildered-looking couple named Henderson, were almost as much victims as I was, though their immediate concern was the large sum of money they'd handed over. They produced documents, a deed, all seemingly legitimate, all bearing signatures that were disturbingly good forgeries of mine and Sarah's. Carol Rumsfeld, they explained, had facilitated the sale, acting as an agent for the HOA, which, according to a convoluted and entirely fabricated story she'd spun, had foreclosed due to multiple, egregious, and long-standing covenant violations on my part, culminating in property abandonment, a ludicrous claim given my documented vacation. The police, bless their local underfunded hearts, were sympathetic but initially out of their depth. Civil matter, Officer Miller mumbled, already eyeing his next call. You'll need a lawyer, sir. Oh, I had a lawyer. I was the lawyer. And my internal counsel was screaming for blood, legally speaking. The Hendersons, convinced by my credentials and the sheer, unadulterated fury radiating from me, agreed to vacate temporarily, retreating to a hotel, their faces a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension that they'd been royally scammed. Their cooperation was the first small victory. It allowed me access. My house felt alien. Our belongings were gone. Vanished. Packed up and put into storage, according to a smirking note left on the kitchen counter, signed with Carol Rumsfeld's ostentatious, loopy signature. The storage company details were conveniently missing. The violation was complete, absolute. They hadn't just taken the structure, they'd taken our lives, our memories, our possessions. Emily's teddy bear, Ben's Lego castles, Sarah's grandmother's antique vanity, irreplaceable. The cold rage solidified into something harder, denser. This wasn't just about legal retribution anymore. This was personal. This was about scorching the earth. The following morning, after a tense night in a sterile hotel room, the kids confused and scared, Sarah oscillating between tears and a simmering anger that matched my own, I began my counteroffensive. First, a motion for an emergency ex parte order to regain possession of my property and to freeze any assets related to the fraudulent sale. Jess was already digging, her fingers flying across her keyboard, unearthing the digital trail of Carol Rumsfeld's malfeasance. The HOA's online portal, their emails, their financial records, it was a surprisingly leaky ship, captained by an arrogant fool. Carol, it turned out, had a history. Not just of petty tyranny, but of financial irregularities within the HOA, small siphoning acts that had gone unnoticed or unchallenged by a complacent board and apathetic residents. This, however, was a quantum leap in her criminal audacity. She had roped in a shady notary, a distant cousin it transpired, and a desperate real estate agent on the verge of bankruptcy. The conspiracy was sloppy, arrogant, built on the assumption that I was just another faceless homeowner who would either roll over or get bogged down in endless, expensive civil litigation. The arrogance was her fatal flaw. It always is with these types. They underestimate, they overreach, they believe their own carefully constructed delusions of power. Jess's first major hit came within hours. Emails between Carol and the real estate agent Barry the Barracuda Finley, his own moniker apparently outlining the scheme. He's on vacation, won't know what hit him, Carol had typed. Quick sale, quick commission. The HOA needs the funds for the beautification project. My new jacuzzi, LOL. The sheer, unadulterated gall of it was breathtaking. The beautification project was a slush fund, and my house was meant to be its primary contributor. The evidence mounted. Forged power of attorney documents. Falsified HOA resolutions authorizing the foreclosure. Bank transfers that screamed money laundering light. Each document, each email, was another nail in Carol Rumsfeld's legal coffin. The local police, initially dismissive, were now paying very close attention, especially after I presented them with a preliminary file thick enough to stop a door, highlighting multiple felonies. Detective Reynolds, a weary veteran who'd seen his share of suburban drama, raised an eyebrow. Federal prosecutor, you say? This is comprehensive. His tone had shifted from polite indifference to professional interest. The system, slow and cumbersome as it often is, was beginning to grind in my favor. The local DA's office, on seeing the evidence of blatant fraud, forgery, and conspiracy, began to take a very keen interest. They recognized the fingerprints of a federal case, even if it was currently playing out in their local jurisdiction. Carol Rumsfeld thought she was a queen ruling her little cul-de-sac kingdom. She had no idea she'd just declared war on a Department of Justice. She thought she was swatting a fly. She'd actually punched a hornet's nest. The temporary order was granted. We were legally back in our house, though it was an empty, violated shell. The locks were changed again, this time by a locksmith I trusted. The sold sign was torn down, not with triumph, but with a grim sense of purpose. This was just the beginning. The road to true justice, to dismantling the entire rotten edifice of the Oakhaven HOA under Carol Rumsfeld's reign, was going to be long. But I had the map, the training, and an unquenchable thirst for righteous retribution. They didn't know I was a federal lawyer. They thought they were dealing with just another resident, easily intimidated, easily swindled. This monumental error in judgment was the fulcrum upon which their entire corrupt enterprise would be broken. My authority wasn't just dormant. It was a sleeping giant they had rudely, foolishly, and catastrophically awakened. The cold, hard truth of my profession, a truth I usually compartmentalized away from my home life, now became my primary weapon. I was a federal prosecutor. My days were spent dissecting complex criminal enterprises, following tangled money trails, and putting people who believed themselves above the law behind bars for very long stretches of time. Carol Rumsfeld and her little HOA cabal were, in the grand scheme of my professional life, amateurs. Dangerous, destructive amateurs, certainly, but amateurs nonetheless. Their scheme, while devastatingly effective against an unsuspecting civilian, was riddled with the kind of hubris and sloppy execution that I preyed upon. The decision to unleash the full scope of my legal and investigative training wasn't made lightly. It was a crossing of a personal Rubicon. My home was meant to be a sanctuary from the darkness I confronted daily, not an extension of it. But Carol had brought the darkness to my doorstep, had violated that sanctuary in the most profound way imaginable. There was no longer a separation. My family, Sarah's quiet, steely resolve, Emily's anxious questions about her missing toys, Ben's heartbreaking confusion, they were the fuel for this fire. This wasn't just about legal principles anymore. It was about restoring their sense of security, about demonstrating that such egregious wrongs would not stand. The initial shock had burned off, leaving behind a cold, methodical determination. My mind, accustomed to constructing complex cases, began to lay out the strategy. This wouldn't be a simple lawsuit to recover damages. This would be a systematic dismantling. I would not just reclaim what was mine. I would ensure that the Oakhaven Homeowners Association, as it currently existed and operated, would cease to be a threat to anyone, ever again. The status reveal, when it began to filter through the neighborhood grapevine and into the ears of the HOA board, was, I imagine, rather chilling for them. Did you hear? The guy whose house Carol tried to sell? He's a Fed. Like, FBI-level lawyer. The whispers probably started small, then grew into a panicked murmur. The HOA board members, previously content to let Carol run amok as long as their own pet projects were funded and their minor infractions overlooked, would now be feeling a different kind of heat. The kind that doesn't come from a faulty tanning bed. My name, which Carol had likely seen only on HOA dues notices and violation warnings, would now be associated with something far more formidable. It was a name that appeared on federal indictments, a name that judges and defense attorneys treated with a certain grim respect. This wasn't Mr. Henderson from 12 Elm Drive, the quiet guy who occasionally forgot to bring in his trash cans on time. This was Assistant United States Attorney Henderson, a man whose very job description involved making people like Carol Rumsfeld profoundly regret their life choices. The beauty of their arrogance was that they left a trail. A wide, well-marked, neon-lit trail. Carol, in her delusion of untouchability, had used HOA email accounts, HOA bank accounts, and even held emergency HOA meetings, attended only by herself and her pet poodle, presumably, to authorize her fraudulent actions, meticulously documenting her own crimes in the HOA's official records, believing them to be sacrosanct, impenetrable. She didn't realize those records were now subject to subpoenas that I could draft in my sleep. My first official act, beyond securing my home, was to file a comprehensive criminal complaint with the state authorities, detailing not just the fraudulent sale of my house, but also a pattern of financial mismanagement, embezzlement, and wire fraud extending back years. I CC'd the FBI's white-collar crime division for good measure. Let them know a federal colleague was being victimized on their turf. The shift in my demeanor was palpable, even to myself. The casual weariness of a man returning from vacation was replaced by a focused intensity. My movements became more deliberate, my words more precise. When I spoke to Detective Reynolds now, it wasn't as a frantic victim, but as a professional colleague outlining a clear-cut case. He listened, nodding slowly, the civil matter dismissal long forgotten. "This is extensive," he'd say, looking at the flowcharts I'd begun to create, mapping out Carol's network of complicity, the flow of illicit funds. She really thought she could get away with this? It was a rhetorical question. Of course she did. Narcissists always do, right up until the moment the cell door slammed shut. The fight to reclaim our stolen possessions was a parallel battle, equally infuriating. The storage company Carol had used was a fly-by-night operation run by another cousin, a greasy individual named Sal who specialized in discreet removals. It took a court order and the threat of immediate arrest for conspiracy and theft before Sal, sweating profusely, led us to a grimy lockup containing our worldly goods, carelessly thrown into boxes, some damaged, some missing. Each broken heirloom, each lost memento, was another entry in the indictment I was building in my head, an indictment against Carol Rumsfeld's soul, if she even possessed one. The emotional toll on my family was immense, but watching me work, seeing the methodical, relentless way I began to dissect the HOA's rotten core, seemed to give Sarah a measure of grim satisfaction. "Show them, David," she'd said, her voice tight with anger. "Show them who they messed with." And so I would. The reluctant warrior was fully engaged. Oakhaven Estates wasn't just a collection of houses anymore, it was a target. And Carol Rumsfeld was about to learn that some lines, once crossed, trigger a response so overwhelming, so legally devastating, that nothing will ever be the same again. Her reign of terror was officially on the clock. The hunt was on. My home office, usually a sanctuary for quiet contemplation or catching up on case files after hours, transformed into a war room. Blueprints of the neighborhood weren't strictly necessary, but I pulled up the county plat maps anyway, marking key properties, identifying potential allies and adversaries among the residents. The HOA's own publicly available documents, bylaws, meeting minutes, the sanitized ones at least, architectural guidelines, were spread across my desk, annotated with furious precision. This was no longer just about my house, it was about systemic abuse. Carol Rumsfeld was the figurehead, the cartoon villain, but the rot often went deeper. Apathy, complicity, fear. These were the fertile grounds in which her tyranny had flourished. My sidekick emerged from an unexpected quarter. Old Mr. Abernathy, a retired electrical engineer who lived 2 streets over, was known primarily for his eccentric Christmas light displays and his equally eccentric theories about government surveillance. He was also, it turned out, a meticulous observer of neighborhood goings-on. Armed with a surprisingly sophisticated array of security cameras, he'd installed to monitor squirrel incursions, but which captured a great deal more. He'd approached me hesitantly one afternoon, clutching a USB drive. "Mr. Henderson," he'd begun, his voice a conspiratorial whisper, "I couldn't help but notice the commotion at your residence. And, well, Carol Rumsfeld has always struck me as a woman operating on a different frequency, if you catch my drift." He caught my drift. His footage, time-stamped and crystal clear, showed Carol directing the movers, Sal's goons, at my house. It showed her meeting with Barry Finlay, the shady real estate agent, on multiple occasions, their body language furtive and conspiratorial. It even captured her triumphant little jig on her own porch the day the "sold" sign went up on my lawn. Gold. Pure, unadulterated prosecutorial gold. "Mr. Abernathy," I said, my voice filled with a new respect for the man, "you may have just become the star witness in a rather significant case." He beamed, his conspiracy theories momentarily validated. I always knew my vigilance would pay off. His tech savviness, honed by years of tinkering with circuits and code, also proved invaluable. He helped Jess and me navigate the archaic digital infrastructure of the HOA's website, finding backdoors and archived files that Carol had presumed deleted. The sheer volume of her self-incrimination was staggering. She had used the HOA's official email for her criminal correspondence, creating an irrefutable paper trail. My inner monologue became a constant tactical assessment. Step 1. Secure the evidence. Step 2. Identify all co-conspirators. Step 3. Build an airtight case for criminal prosecution. Step 4. Simultaneously, initiate civil proceedings to dissolve the HOA and recover damages for all affected homeowners. The dark situational irony was not lost on me. Carol, in her obsessive quest to enforce rules about the precise shade of beige one could paint their shutters, had flagrantly disregarded the most fundamental laws of property and decency. Her reign of micromanagement was about to be macro-managed into oblivion by the federal justice system she clearly neither understood nor respected. The initial discovery requests I served on the HOA were met with bluster and attempted stonewalling from the HOA's retained counsel, a local ambulance chaser named Fitch, who clearly hadn't grasped the gravity of the situation or the identity of opposing counsel. His dismissive tone in early communications was almost comical. My client, Mrs. Rumsfeld, and the Oakhaven HOA categorically deny any wrongdoing and view your spurious allegations as a blatant attempt to circumvent legitimate community standards. Legitimate community standards. I nearly laughed. Forging deeds and stealing houses was now a community standard in Oakhaven. Fitch's amusement would be short-lived. The first round of subpoenas, targeted with surgical precision at bank records, personal emails, and the records of the complicit notary and real estate agent, wiped the smirk right off his face. The volume of data we began to accumulate was immense. Jess, fueled by caffeine and righteous indignation, worked tirelessly, cross-referencing transactions, highlighting incriminating phrases, building timelines. We discovered a pattern of embezzlement that went far beyond Carol's jacuzzi fund. Falsified invoices for landscaping never done, consulting fees paid to shell companies owned by her relatives, outright cash withdrawals masked as petty cash for community events that never occurred. The HOA was her personal piggy bank, and my house was supposed to be the grand refilling. The more we dug, the more other residents, emboldened by the news of my fight, began to come forward with their own stories of Carol's abuses, arbitrary fines, vendettas against anyone who dared question her authority, preferential treatment for her cronies on the board. The silent majority was finding its voice. Oakhaven Estates wasn't just a collection of houses adhering to a set of oppressive rules. It was a powder keg, and Carol Rumsfeld had handed me the match. My legal strategy was indeed becoming a tactical operation. Each piece of evidence was a round of ammunition. Each subpoena was a targeted strike. The goal wasn't just to win, it was to achieve total victory, to liberate the entire neighborhood from this petty dictatorship. The full weight of my federal experience, the years spent taking down sophisticated criminal organizations, was now being brought to bear on a suburban homeowners association. It was, in many ways, overkill. Glorious, righteous overkill. The initial legal salvos were designed to shock and awe. The emergency restraining order freezing the HOA's primary operational bank accounts, the ones Carol had been using for her illicit transactions, caused immediate panic. Suddenly, the landscaping company wasn't getting paid, the pool maintenance was overdue, and the other board members, who had largely been asleep at the wheel, were jolted into a state of terrified awareness. My petition to the court, meticulously documented and citing not just my own case but hinting at a broader pattern of fraud, was a masterpiece of controlled fury. I laid out the timeline of the fraudulent sale, the evidence of forgery, the clear intent to defraud. I attached key emails, Abernathy's damning video stills, and the preliminary findings from the bank records. When I presented this to Detective Reynolds, his eyes widened. "This isn't just a local spat, is it?" he asked, the realization dawning. "This is organized. This is audacious." He assigned 2 of his best fraud investigators to the case full-time. The local DA, a pragmatic woman named Maria Sanchez, whom I knew peripherally from state federal task forces, called me directly. "David," she said, her voice devoid of pleasantries, "what in God's name is happening in Oakhaven? My office is being flooded with calls from panicked HOA board members, and your filings read like a RICO indictment." "Close, Maria," I replied, my tone grim. "Very close." Carol Rumsfeld decided to branch out from lawn violations to grand theft auto, only with houses. There was a pause. "She sold your house while you were on vacation?" "And emptied it," I confirmed. She didn't count on me being quite so motivated to seek redress. "Motivated," Sanchez echoed. "David, you're about to unleash a legal firestorm on these people. Are you sure the local infrastructure can handle the fallout?" "They started the fire, Maria. I'm just going to make sure it burns them down to the foundations." My interactions with the HOA's lawyer, Fitch, became increasingly one-sided. His initial bluster evaporated, replaced by a desperate, almost pleading tone in his emails. He tried to arrange a settlement conference. "Mr. Henderson, surely we can resolve this amicably. A misunderstanding, perhaps. Mr. Fitch." I wrote back, my words dripping with ice. "Your client attempted to steal my home, my possessions, and my family's peace of mind through deliberate, calculated fraud. The time for amicable resolution passed the moment she forged my signature. We are now in the consequences phase. Prepare your client." The trap was set. Carol, believing herself insulated by the HOA structure and Fitch's initially confident assurances, had walked right into it. She had no idea of the storm of legal documents, subpoenas, and witness testimonies that was about to descend upon her. The beauty of the law, when wielded as a weapon by someone who truly understands its power, is its inexorable logic. There is no hiding from a well-drafted subpoena. There is no arguing with bank records that clearly show embezzlement. The other HOA board members, particularly the treasurer, a nervous man named Arthur Jenkins who had clearly been bullied or duped by Carol, began to crack under the pressure. Jess, with her uncanny ability to be both empathetic and terrifyingly persistent, managed to get him on the phone. He sang like a canary, detailing Carol's iron-fisted control over the finances, her dismissal of any questions, her vague threats against anyone who opposed her. "She said it was for emergency contingencies," Arthur stammered. "That the HOA needed a robust discretionary fund. I never imagined this." This was the tactical ops metaphor playing out in real time. Arthur was the compromised asset we turned. His testimony, corroborated by the financial records, would be devastating to Carol's defense and crucial in piercing the corporate veil of the HOA itself, holding individual board members accountable for their negligence, if not outright complicity. The local corruption ties were also beginning to surface. The notary public who had so readily stamped Carol's forged documents was her second cousin, with a string of minor disciplinary actions from the state licensing board. The real estate agent, Barry Finley, had a gambling problem and a history of desperate deals. They were weak links, easily pressured, easily flipped. Each successful deposition, each damning document uncovered, was another click of the ratchet, tightening the noose. The local news, initially treating it as a quirky HOA dispute gone wild story, started to pick up on the more serious criminal undertones, especially after the DA's office confirmed an active investigation. Carol Rumsfeld's carefully curated image as Oakhaven's benevolent dictator was beginning to crumble. The legal labyrinth was no longer a maze for me. It was a weaponized environment, and I was navigating it with the deadly precision of a predator. The siege of the Oakhaven HOA was well underway, and its queen was about to be dethroned, very, very publicly. The pressure began to tell, not just on Carol, but on the entire edifice of the Oakhaven HOA. My relentless legal assault, coupled with the burgeoning criminal investigation, sent ripples of panic through the neighborhood. Suddenly, those meticulously manicured lawns and perfectly painted fences seemed less like symbols of order and more like the gilded bars of a cage ruled by a delusional tyrant. Neighbors who had previously suffered Carol's reign in silence, fearing her vindictive fines and public shamings at HOA meetings, started to find their courage. Anonymously at first, then more openly, stories began to circulate, tales of outrageous demands, inconsistent enforcement of rules, and a climate of fear. Mrs. Henderson, my buyer, shared her experience of Carol's high-pressure sales tactics and outright lies. Others recalled threats over holiday decorations deemed tacky, or children's play equipment declared an affront to community aesthetics. The HOA's carefully crafted facade of serene suburban order was cracking, revealing the petty ugliness beneath. My sidekick, Mr. Abernathy, became something of a local folk hero, his squirrel cam footage whispered about with a mixture of awe and amusement. He even started a small encrypted email list to share updates, carefully vetted by me to avoid compromising the investigation, of course. His deadpan delivery of the latest legal maneuver or piece of damning evidence found its way into neighborhood conversations, injecting a much-needed dose of dark humor into the grim proceedings. Heard Carol tried to claim the HOA's purchase of a diamond-encrusted tiara was a community beautification expense, he'd write, a fabrication on his part, but one that perfectly captured the absurdity of her actual embezzlements. The HOA board meetings, once sparsely attended affairs where Carol would grandstand uninterrupted, became tense, crowded spectacles. Residents, armed with copies of my initial court filings, which had become public record, began to ask pointed questions. Where was the money? Why had the board allowed Carol to operate with such unchecked power? Why were their property values now potentially threatened by scandal and criminal investigation? Carol, predictably, became increasingly unhinged. Her usual imperious demeanor gave way to shrill defensiveness and outright paranoia. At one particularly memorable meeting, captured on multiple cell phone cameras, she accused the assembled residents of being disloyal insurrectionists and threatened to triple everyone's dues for lack of community spirit. The performance did not play well. It only solidified the growing consensus that she was unfit to lead, if not certifiably insane. Her lawyer, Fitch, looked increasingly miserable, his attempts to control his client futile. He was a man watching his retainer fee burn in a dumpster fire of his client's making. The financial records, once subpoenaed and laid bare, told a sordid tale. It wasn't just my house. Carol had systematically bilked the HOA for years. Lavish personal expenses disguised as HOA business. Spa days listed as stress management seminars for board members. Expensive dinners with potential contractors who never materialized. Even payments for her prize-winning poodle's grooming under groundskeeper image enhancement. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. She had treated the HOA coffers as her personal slush fund, and the other board members had either been too intimidated, too incompetent, or too self-interested to stop her. My team, Jess, primarily with input from Mr. Abernathy's digital sleuthing, meticulously pieced together the puzzle. We found emails where Carol explicitly instructed the pliable treasurer, Arthur Jenkins, to misclassify expenses. We found invoices from phantom companies that traced back to P.O. boxes rented by Carol under false names. The on-screen text of these emails and invoices, if this were a movie, would be damning. Urgent. Reclassify spa day under Community Outreach Program, CR, or an invoice for 5-0 from Evergreen Landscaping Solutions, a company consisting solely of Carol's unemployed nephew and a rusty lawnmower, for seasonal planting consultation. The visual metaphor of a WW.O, meticulously kept garden, rotten at the roots, was unavoidable. The fence, that symbol of boundaries and defiance, was now something the entire community felt Carol had breached, not just with me, but with all of them. They had paid their dues, adhered to her often arbitrary rules, all under the assumption that the HOA was, at its core, working for their collective benefit. That illusion was shattered. The emotional tone in the neighborhood shifted from fear to righteous fury, a collective echo of my own. My protective loyalty, initially focused solely on my family, expanded. These were my neighbors, people who, like me, had simply wanted a peaceful place to live, not a battleground lorded over by a petty tyrant. They deserved justice too. The impending legal doom was palpable. Carol, however, seemed incapable of grasping it, cocooned in her narcissism. She continued to send out violation notices from her diminished throne, one for a non-compliant wind chime, even as sheriff's deputies were interviewing her former board colleagues. It was the desperate act of a dictator clinging to the last vestiges of imaginary power, a spectacle of pathetic delusion that only hastened her downfall. The deeper we dug, the more intricate Carol Rumsfeld's web of deceit became. It wasn't just petty embezzlement for spa days and poodle grooming. This was a calculated, long-term siphoning operation that implicated more than just her easily swayed treasurer. There were kickbacks from favored vendors, inflated contracts for simple services, and a clear pattern of using HOA funds to enhance her own property and lifestyle under the guise of community improvements. The smoking gun, or rather, a series of smoking guns, emerged from a forgotten backup server of the HOA's old accounting software, a system Carol thought had been wiped clean. Mr. Abernathy, with his almost supernatural affinity for outdated technology, managed to recover fragments of deleted ledgers and email archives. These were the digital ghosts Carol couldn't exorcise. One particularly damning email thread revealed Carol colluding with a local roofing contractor, who also happened to be her brother-in-law. The HOA had paid an exorbitant sum for emergency roof repairs on the community clubhouse, a clubhouse whose roof was, by all other accounts, in perfectly good condition. The emails detailed how the invoice would be inflated, how the excess funds would be split, and how Carol would personally ensure the bid was approved without scrutiny from the less financially astute board members. "Make sure the paperwork looks legit, Kevin." These busybodies on the board wouldn't know a soffit from a sinner, she'd typed, a casual dismissal of her colleagues that dripped with contempt. The forged financial reports became a key focus. Jess, with her forensic accounting skills, demonstrated how Carol had systematically manipulated the HOA's quarterly statements, hiding illicit expenditures under vague budget categories like contingency fund or administrative overheads. The sums weren't massive on an individual basis, but cumulatively, over several years, they amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen from the community. My inner monologue during this phase was less about righteous anger and more about a cold, grim satisfaction. It was like assembling a complex puzzle where each piece clicked perfectly into place, revealing a picture of calculated, unrepentant greed. She thought she was clever. She thought no one would look this closely. She underestimated everyone. The on-screen text prompts in my mind were now flashing terms like wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to defraud, aggravated identity theft. Each term carried significant federal sentencing guidelines. The local corruption, while not extending to City Hall, was certainly evident in the network of complicit businesses and individuals Carol had cultivated. The notary cousin, the desperate real estate agent, the kickback-paying brother-in-law contractor, they were all small cogs in her corrupt machine. Each motivated by their own minor desperations or loyalties, all now facing their own legal jeopardy. I made a strategic decision to offer cooperation deals to some of these smaller players in exchange for their full testimony against Carol. The pressure on them was immense. Faced with the prospect of criminal charges and the full weight of a federal prosecutor's interest, even if I was technically the victim, my professional shadow loomed large. They began to crumble. Barry Finlay, the real estate agent, was the first to flip, providing a sworn affidavit detailing Carol's orchestration of the fraudulent house sale, her assurances that it was all perfectly legal, just a bit unorthodox. His testimony painted a vivid picture of her manipulative charm and ruthless determination. The visual metaphor of thermal camera overlays felt apt. We were seeing through the layers of deception, identifying the heat signatures of guilt. Carol's carefully constructed suburban idyll was a hotbed of fraud, and she was the radiant center. The evidence against her personally, and against the HOA as a criminally complicit entity, was now overwhelming. It was no longer a question of if she would face charges, but when and how many. The case had transcended a mere property dispute. It was now a full-blown white-collar criminal investigation, spearheaded by the local DA but with my fingerprints all over the evidence gathering and legal strategy. The narrative of HOA Karen was about to take a very dark, very public turn. Carol Rumsfeld had not only sold my house, she had unwittingly signed her own indictment, written in the indelible ink of her own greed and arrogance. The day of reckoning was fast approaching, and the justice system, armed with the irrefutable evidence we had painstakingly gathered, was about to deliver a verdict she could neither ignore nor escape. The culmination of weeks of relentless investigation and legal maneuvering arrived on a deceptively bright Tuesday morning. 2 detectives from the county sheriff's office, accompanied by a uniformed officer, walked up Carol Rumsfeld's perfectly manicured flagstone path. Detective Reynolds, who had taken a personal interest in the case, led the way, an arrest warrant clutched in his hand. I wasn't there physically, of course. That would have been improper, a conflict of interest given my victim status. But Mr. Abernathy, bless his voyeuristic soul, had his squirrel cam perfectly positioned. He later provided me with the footage, a silent movie of suburban justice delivered. Carol answered the door in her silk dressing gown, a half-eaten croissant in one hand, a look of regal annoyance on her face, clearly expecting another supplicant neighbor or perhaps a delivery. The sight of the officers wiped the condescension from her features, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear, quickly masked by bluster. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice still attempting its usual imperious tone, though it wavered slightly. Detective Reynolds, his face impassive, simply stated, "Carol Rumsfeld, you are under arrest for multiple counts of felony fraud, forgery, embezzlement, and conspiracy." The color drained from Carol's face. The croissant dropped to her pristine porch. Her protests began then, shrill and incoherent. "This is outrageous. A misunderstanding. I am the president of this homeowners association. You can't do this. Do you know who I am?" It was the classic cry of the entitled narcissist, suddenly confronted with consequences they believed only applied to lesser mortals. The handcuffs clicked audibly, even on Mr. Abernathy's recording. The metallic sound seemed to echo through the quiet, stunned neighborhood. Several neighbors, drawn by the commotion or perhaps alerted by the unofficial neighborhood watch, had gathered at a respectful distance, their faces a mixture of shock and something akin to grim satisfaction. This was the public embarrassment, the first stage of her reckoning. The queen was being dethroned, not in a palace coup, but on her own doorstep, in her dressing gown, bound for the county jail. The news spread like wildfire. "Carol Rumsfeld arrested." The text messages and hushed phone calls flew across Oakhaven Estates. The on-screen text, if this were that movie, would be a series of news headlines. HOA president arrested in shocking fraud scheme. Local community leader accused of embezzlement. Forgery. Oakhaven Estates, scandal deepens. Her booking photo, when it inevitably leaked, was a stark contrast to her usual carefully coiffed and made-up public persona. Stripped of her artifice, she looked haggard, defeated, and utterly bewildered. The legal battle was far from over, but this was a significant victory. The criminal charges, meticulously prepared by the DA's office using the mountain of evidence we had supplied, were serious. They carried substantial prison time. The HOA board, or what was left of it after several panicked resignations, was in disarray. Their lawyer, Fitch, was now desperately trying to distance the HOA as an entity from Carol's criminal actions. A near impossible task given how intertwined her personal fraud was with the HOA's operations and finances. My own civil suit, seeking not only the return of my stolen property, which was now a moot point as I had regained possession, but also significant damages for the emotional distress the property damage, and the sheer audacity of the crime moved forward. More importantly, I filed a separate petition, supported by a significant number of newly emboldened Oak Haven residents, to place the HOA into receivership and begin proceedings for its dissolution. The public reckoning was not just about Carol's personal downfall, it was about dismantling the entire corrupt structure she had created and controlled. The arrest was the climactic confrontation I had envisioned, not a shouting match or a physical altercation, but the cold, impartial hand of the law finally closing around her. My role was that of the architect of that moment, the unseen force that had set the wheels of justice in motion. There was a somber resilience in watching it unfold, even secondhand. It had to be done. She had left no other choice. The moral cost of her actions was now being publicly accounted for, and the blood, metaphorically speaking, was on her hands, not mine. The community, once cowed, was now stirring with a newfound sense of agency. They had witnessed the fall of their tyrant, and the psychological chains she had forged were breaking. The porch light, once a symbol of her invasive scrutiny, now felt like it could belong to anyone again. Carol Rumsfeld's reign was over. The war was won. Now came the difficult but necessary task of rebuilding and ensuring such a tyranny could never take root in Oak Haven again. The arrest of Carol Rumsfeld was the tipping point, but the ultimate goal was the complete dismantling of the Oak Haven Homeowners Association as it had existed under her corrupt regime. The petition for receivership and dissolution, backed by a significant percentage of homeowners now organized and vocal, moved through the civil courts with surprising speed. The evidence of systemic mismanagement, fraud, and abuse of power was so overwhelming that the judge overseeing the case had little choice but to act decisively. The remaining HOA board members, terrified of being held personally liable for Carol's depredations and the HOA's mounting legal fees, offered little resistance. Fitch, their hapless lawyer, essentially threw in the towel, advising them to cooperate fully to mitigate their own potential culpability. My role shifted from relentless prosecutor to a sort of de facto community organizer and legal guide. I helped draft the arguments for dissolution, highlighting how the HOA's governing documents had been perverted, its finances plundered, and its authority weaponized against the very residents it was supposed to serve. The narrative was clear. This HOA was not just poorly run, it was fundamentally broken, a vehicle for one woman's criminal enterprise. The court appointed a receiver, a neutral third-party attorney, to take control of the HOA's remaining assets, meager as they were after Carol's plundering and the legal bills, manage its outstanding obligations, and oversee the process of winding down its operations. This was a crucial step. It meant that the power structure Carol had built was officially gone. No more arbitrary fines, no more dictatorial pronouncements from on high. The neighbors, my rebellion fodder, turned active participants, attended the court hearings in surprising numbers. They shared their own stories with the receiver, providing further evidence of the HOA's dysfunction. There was a palpable sense of liberation in the air. People were talking to each other again, not in hushed whispers about Carol's latest outrage, but about how they wanted their neighborhood to function moving forward. The symbolic revenge tied to my family legacy was profound. This house, our sanctuary, had been violated. Now, the very entity that enabled that violation was being legally executed. The process of dissolving an HOA is complex, involving settling debts, terminating contracts, and, most importantly, nullifying the CCR's covenants, conditions, and restrictions that had been the source of so much strife. This was the ultimate victory. Not just removing Carol, but removing the legal framework that had given her such oppressive power. The visual metaphor of fences coming down was almost literal. While actual fences remained, the invisible fences of arbitrary rules and fear were being dismantled. The Architectural Review Committee, Carol's personal inquisition squad, was disbanded. The power to dictate the color of your mailbox, or the type of flowers you could plant, was returned to individual homeowners. There were, of course, practical considerations. Who would manage the communal areas, the small park, the entrance landscaping? We formed a voluntary neighborhood committee, a far cry from the autocratic HOA, to handle these basic shared responsibilities through consensus and transparent budgeting. It wasn't perfect, but it was democratic. and it was ours. The news of the Oak Haven HOA's dissolution made local headlines again, this time as a cautionary tale for other overzealous HOAs and a story of resident empowerment. Oak Haven HOA officially disbanded after fraud scandal. Residents reclaim control of neighborhood. The legal filings for dissolution were public record, a blueprint for other communities suffering under similar tyrannies. My powerful statements, both in court and in community meetings, focused on the principles of fairness, accountability, and the right to peaceful enjoyment of one's property. An HOA should serve its residents, not enslave them, I'd argued. When it becomes a tool for personal enrichment and vendetta, it forfeits its right to exist. The slow zoom in my mind's eye was on the faces of my neighbors as the final court order was read. The Oak Haven Homeowners Association was no more. The relief was palpable. The surprise reversal was complete. The HOA, which thought it held all the power, which believed it could act with impunity, was gone. They had underestimated the resolve of a community pushed too far, and they had catastrophically underestimated the capabilities of one particular resident they had wronged. The rhetoric had been carefully calibrated, but the justice was absolute. The structure that allowed Carol Rumsfeld to sell my house, to terrorize my neighbors, to embezzle funds with impunity, was now just a footnote in legal history. The neighborhood was free. They didn't operate here anymore. Not this HOA, not under these rules, not with this kind of power. The process had been grueling, but the outcome was a clean slate. The final act was the satisfaction of knowing that the system, when pushed hard enough by those who understand its levers, could indeed deliver justice, not just for one, but for many. The porch light on my house now burned brighter, a beacon of reclaimed control, not just for my family, but for the entire street. The dust settled slowly over Oak Haven Estates, or rather, what was once Oak Haven Estates and was now just a collection of homes on streets with familiar names, blessedly free from the suffocating oversight of a defunct homeowners association. Carol Rumsfeld, after a surprisingly swift trial given the mountain of irrefutable evidence, was convicted on multiple felony counts. Her delusions of grandeur shattered against the cold, hard reality of a state penitentiary. Her appeals, handled by a series of increasingly desperate public defenders, went nowhere. The sentence was significant, a stark message that white-collar crime, even on a suburban scale, has severe consequences. My family and I reclaimed our lives, piece by piece. The empty spaces in our home were refilled, not just with new possessions, but with a renewed sense of security, hard-won and deeply cherished. Emily got a new, even fluffier teddy bear. Ben rebuilt his Lego empire, grander than before. Sarah and I would sometimes sit on our porch in the evenings, watching the neighborhood kids play freely, no longer under the shadow of Carol's disapproving gaze or the threat of a violation notice for an errant frisbee. There was a lingering shadow, of course. The moral cost, the emotional toll of the battle, wasn't insignificant. The weeks of tension, the violation of our sanctuary, the sheer effort of the fight, it left its mark. It was a somber resilience that settled over us, a quiet understanding of what we had overcome. The locked gate, not a literal one, but the psychological closure of knowing it was truly over, was a profound relief. The neighborhood, too, found a new equilibrium. The voluntary committee managed the shared spaces with a light touch and transparent finances. People talked more, collaborated more. The fear was gone, replaced by a cautious optimism and a fierce protectiveness of their newfound freedom. They had seen what unchecked power could do, and they were determined not to let it happen again. My role as the reluctant warrior faded. I was once again David Henderson, federal prosecutor by day, husband and father by night. But something had changed. My neighbors looked at me differently, with a respect that went beyond mere neighborliness. I had, in a very real sense, liberated them. The experience became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered among newer residents. You won't believe what happened here a few years ago. With the HOA, they crossed the line. They crossed a line so egregious, so fundamentally wrong, that it demanded not just a response, but an obliteration of the system that allowed it. And now, that line, and the entity that drew it, was gone. My intensely personal battle had become a public reckoning, a tactical justice fantasy played out in the mundane setting of suburban America. The cold-blooded calm with which I had approached the legal strategy had masked an explosive emotional undercurrent of righteous fury and protective loyalty. The deadpan sarcasm I'd occasionally allowed myself was a necessary release valve against the sheer absurdity of it all. They didn't operate here anymore. The Oakhaven Homeowners Association was a ghost, a memory. And they, Carol Rumsfeld and her enablers, had learned a devastating lesson about who they were truly dealing with. They had messed with a federal lawyer, a man who understood the precise, weaponized nature of the law, and who was willing to deploy its full force to protect his home, his family, and ultimately, his community. The porch light of our house, now a simple beacon of welcome, was a quiet testament to that victory. Peace had been restored, but it was a peace earned through conflict, a reminder that sometimes, to preserve what you hold dear, you must be willing to go to war, even if the battlefield is your own front yard.